On June 24th, 1947, Kenneth Arnold, an American pilot, saw 9 unidentified objects about Mount Rainier, Washington. Convinced that these objects were Russian in nature and fearing an invasion, Arnold reported the incident to the local FBI office. In December of that year, faced with a growing number of sightings, the Air Force was officially mandated to investigate these mysterious flying saucers. But the military weren't the only ones recruited. The idea of an invasion also worried security agencies. John Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, and Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, director of the recently created CIA, quickly became interested in the sightings as well. However, the public was not to discover their real role in the UFO matter until 30 years later, thanks to the Freedom of Information Act.
For many years, it was the contention of all government offices in the United States that the sole investigator of UFOs was the Air Force. We now know this is absolutely untrue. We know that UFO reports were distributed throughout the United States military, all of the branches, the Air Force, the Army, the Navy. There were Marine Corps sightings. The CIA initiated an interest in UFOs as early as 1948, a very strong interest, covering worldwide sightings, and collected, in fact, some very, very good reports. We also know that the FBI collected many UFO reports, not just in 1947, but beyond that. Other government agencies, such as the Defense Intelligence Agency, Joint Chiefs of Staff, there were, my goodness, emergency UFO reports that went to the White House at various times. So that none of this was known until the era in the United States of the Freedom of Information Act, which really, the Freedom of Information Act became effective in practice after 1974. You might call the first 10 years of the Freedom of Information Act a kind of glory age, in which it was relatively easy for UFO researchers to get some good documents out of the government. In particular, I think under Jimmy Carter, President Carter in the late 70s, who seems to have encouraged a somewhat liberal interpretation of the Freedom of Information Act, which meant basically that it would not be overly expensive for people to request such documents, and that government agencies would have to respond quickly. By the mid-1980s, this was really no longer the case. But for a good 10 years in the United States, UFO researchers were able to get thousands upon thousands of documents from the CIA, the FBI, the DIA, Navy, Army, Air Force, and elsewhere pertaining to UFOs. National Security Agency, the NSA, sometimes known as no such agency, appears to have had a very strong interest in UFOs. We have one NSA UFO report going back to 1953, a few months after the agency was founded, despite the fact that the NSA had maintained that they had absolutely no interest in UFOs at all. So we now know that none of this was the case.
Well, in the 1970s, the United States government released, under provisions of the Freedom of Information Act, thousands of pages of documents relating to UFO reports and to the subject in general, from agencies such as the FBI, CIA, and later many other agencies produced reports. Interestingly, this was after years of denial that they had any such reports. However, many documents remain classified at what amounts to an above top secret level, and even many top secret documents are still being withheld in the interests of national security, and that information is not guesswork. That is actually stated within the context of the security classifications in the documents that have been released. But it's quite clear that there's still a lot being withheld, in my opinion. And I think the most sensitive material is not contained in any document. I think if you talk to anybody in the intelligence community, they'll tell you that the most sensitive information is not written down on the United States government memoranda. Mm-hmm. So there's still a lot to be, there's still a lot being withheld. But what has been released quite clearly evinces evidence, if not proof, of serious government involvement and the delicacy of classification. I mean, there's an FBI document going back to 1949 which says that the subject matter of flying discs, flying saucers, unidentified objects and so forth is considered top secret by a number of the military agencies such as the United States Air Force, Army and Navy. So that information alone is very, very important. National Security Agency was taken to the Supreme Court in 1982 to disclose the reasons why they were withholding a certain amount of documents. And they gave their reasons for withholding the documents in a 21-page above top secret affidavit, which was classified top secret umbra. And I should mention right now, top secret means information, the unauthorized disclosure of which can reasonably be expected to cause exceptionally grave damage to the security. So already we're talking about sensitive material. But the fact that material about UFOs is being classified at an above top secret, I think, tells the whole story. As it happens, I've spoken to somebody who has seen that 21-page above top secret affidavit, and I don't know the details, but I know that the gist of it is that it doesn't talk about recovered alien bodies, United States government contact with aliens, and everything. If there's any information like that, it's unlikely to be on any documents which are shown even in the United States Supreme Court.
Released documents reveal that the CIA initially believed that the UFO phenomenon was simply a rumor spread by subversives. In July 1952, an incident occurred that seemed to support their theory. On July 19 and 26, unidentified objects were detected on radar screens at the National Airport in Washington, D.C. These objects were flying around the White House and the Pentagon, where airspace was restricted at all times. F-94 fighter jets were dispatched, but they never caught up with the speedy objects. While the situation was getting out of control in the air, on the ground, telephone switchboards in the nation's capital were literally paralyzed by calls from concerned citizens, an unexpected turn of events which threatened public safety. A press conference was held on July 27, and the only explanation put forth by the Air Force was temperature inversions. To the CIA, it was beginning to look as if they had a national crisis on their hands. If enemies of the state had wanted to paralyze the country's emergency response teams, they couldn't have found a better way to do it. The CIA demanded a meeting to discuss the flying saucer problem. This meeting took place in January 1953 and was known as the Robertson Panel. Its conclusions had a major impact on the future of UFO investigations.
The Robertson Panel is one of the most important turning points in the history of the American study of UFOs. Most people don't really appreciate the significance of it. In 1952, the UFO wave in the United States reached an absolute peak in terms of the quality and the quantity of what was being seen. As a result of that, the U.S. Air Force held a major press conference in July of '52 that said, no, it's all temperature and weather phenomena. In the public domain, that laid the matter to rest. But in the classified world, I think people understood that this was not a true explanation. Now, the Harry Truman presidency was ending in January of 1953. Very hastily, a panel of Nobel and Nobel caliber scientists was assembled by the CIA to do a classified study of UFOs. This became known as the Robertson Panel after H.P. Robertson, who led it. We now know that the Robertson Panel conclusions were written before the panel convened. And in fact, this panel convened during the very final weekend of the Truman presidency. Rather significant. What the panel said was that UFOs were not a matter of national security. They did not represent any alien technology. And that furthermore, it would be important for the American government to debunk and educate the public on the true nature of UFOs, which was that they were all explainable natural phenomena.
Following the Robertson Panel, it seemed that the FBI, the CIA, and even the NSA, the National Security Agency, took an avid interest in UFOs. This interest was heightened during periods of political unrest, like the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Why? Did these federal agencies all believe that UFOs could be used to destabilize the balance of world power? Were they aware of something more significant with regards to the phenomenon? Unfortunately, documents released to the public do not give us much of a clue. We do know that some of the sightings classified as unidentified objects by Project Blue Book, the team set up to investigate UFOs between 1952 and 1969, were actually CIA spy planes. Did their desire to hide the existence of these spy planes from the American public justify their interest in UFOs? One thing is clear from the thousands of pages of released documents. The primary motivation of information agencies was not to undertake any serious research into the true nature of these UFOs.
Well, many people say that the federal government, the American CIA and the NSA and whatever intelligence organizations there are, and in Canada as well, that these various organizations are really overtly display no interest whatsoever in the subject, but in fact have sort of a secret concern with it and are interested in the subject, and that might very well be true. We have almost no evidence of this, however, and it's might be just sort of a triumph of hope over fact, but my guess is that they really don't care much about the subject at all. I think that the Canadian government and the American government gets its cues essentially in a subject like this from the scientific community, and the scientific community is resolutely hostile to the subject. And it's gotten worse with the scientific community. There's very little wiggle room, as they say. And so in my own research on the subject, I have found no serious evidence of any kind of major studies going on for any country, at least in North America.
In the United States, there was another agency that was often associated with UFOs, NASA. According to some authors, every spaceflight was accompanied by extraterrestrial vehicles. Obviously, NASA has been tight-lipped about these incidents. One such incident was filmed during the Space Shuttle Discovery's mission STS-48 in September 1991. The film was analyzed by University of Nebraska physics professor Jack Kasher.
The Space Shuttle Discovery was flying near Australia at the time, and they had the television cameras on, and it was looking out at the night sky because nothing interesting was going on. And suddenly there appeared a bright light on the right-hand side. There were a number of bright lights that were significant, but this was the most important. And it had started drifting slowly to the left, and it got to a certain point. Suddenly there were two quick flashes on the lower left-hand part of the screen, and apparently in reaction to that, the object shot back up very sharply to the right, and shortly after that, two streaks went through the picture. One right where it had been, or very close to that, and another over here. There was also a second object that had been drifting up. It reacted by moving off also, and there were some over on the right, and they reacted as well. So you had several objects, a double flash, reaction, and then streaks going into where the objects had been. The NASA answer is a reasonable one because it does happen. They said that they were ice particles that were close to the shuttle, and there are ice particles close to the shuttle frequently. And they said that the attitude adjuster rockets went off, and the exhaust from those rockets then blew those ice particles away, and that's what happened. That can happen. And to someone just casually looking at the video, if that's all you do, then it probably seems like a reasonable explanation. I went far beyond that, though, because I took the video and I took the position locations as functions of time, and I made graphs, and I made a very careful scientific study of how the objects reacted and how they moved, in how the flashes would interact with that. And basically, bottom line, I developed what I consider 5 fairly significant and strong proofs that the objects could not have been ice particles.
The film produced during mission STS-48 is not the only one of its kind in NASA archives. Countless numbers of strange objects have been filmed from the time of the Mercury program in the early 1960s to to recent shuttle flights. In July 1969, the day before the first astronauts landed on the moon, the crew of Apollo 11 filmed two odd lights, which were later rationalized as reflections off the windows of the Lunar Excursion Module.
I can't say for sure that they were hiding information in this case. I do suspect that NASA has been involved with UFOs, and it really would seem reasonable to me that if they are involved with UFOs, that they would tend to cover it up. UFOs are very interesting objects, and it's not really a matter of whether the government is covering up UFO information. They are. It's a matter of court record that the government has documents that deal with UFOs, and they are classified. So there are those documents that exist, and so quite possibly NASA has some too. I cannot say for sure that they are specifically involved in the STS-48 as a cover-up, but I do have confidence in my study, and I think that I can establish fairly well that these were actually spacecraft of some kind, not ice particles.
I've spoken to many astronauts. The majority of them, I believe, have not in fact seen UFOs, and they become distressed when a lot of reports have been attributed to them. But there certainly have been a number of unexplained reports. For example, James McDivitt told me that he was puzzled by an object that he saw in one of the Gemini flights. And I've had letters from other astronauts saying they've been puzzled by certain things, some of which have been explained. I think all the so-called smoking gun, I don't know if you're familiar with the smoking gun, the shuttle footage, I'm totally unconvinced. I think that nearly all those pictures show ice crystals being blown away by the directional thrusters on the shuttle. That's my own opinion, so I think that's all nonsense about those things. If the idea that NASA would release all this stuff openly every day to the public is ridiculous if they were actual UFOs. They don't look like UFOs, they don't behave like UFOs, and they're not UFOs in my opinion. NASA has released a number of documents which, in fact, I've published in Beyond Top Secret, which is the revised and updated edition of Above Top Secret, and I published quite a lot of information also in Above Top Secret, my first book, which is now out of print. And quite clearly that indicates a serious involvement on the part of NASA. NASA itself classifies a lot of information at confidential, secret, top secret, and above top secret. We know that. I know that from their physical security handbook. And I'm quite sure that a lot of material by NASA is being withheld.
In Canada, the UFO matter was never really assigned to civil authorities as it was in the States. The only significant episode dates back to the early 1950s. Wilbert Smith, an engineer working for the Federal Department of Transport, undertook an initiative of his own, with the support of his superiors, to study all of the UFO reports collected by the Department of National Defense and Transport Canada. Smith was hoping to draw valuable scientific information from these reports. His study was known as Project Magnet.
In 1950 and 51 and in 1952, Canadian scientist and government official Wilbert Smith with the Department of Transportation had a very, very strong interest in UFOs. And I think what appears to be on his own initiative did a tremendous amount of research on this topic. Spoke to many American officials, including a defense scientist named Robert Sarbacher, who told him that UFOs in America were considered the highest matter of security. Wilbert Smith also became very close with Donald Keyhoe, who organized NICAP several years later. Wilbert Smith was able to get approval for something known as Project Magnet, which occurred in Canada. And this was a study that would attempt to measure the appearance of UFOs by setting up instrumentation that would detect them through electromagnetic means. It is believed, in fact, the project did record a success shortly before it was closed down in the early 1950s. It has been said that the project was going to be closed down anyway due to either lack of interest or an unwillingness on the part of the Canadian government to support the project. Following Project Magnet, It's very similar in a sense to the closing of Project Blue Book in the United States, which was basically a policy of debunking and shutting off of good UFO information.
Smith did not hide the fact that he believed the UFOs were interplanetary craft. So in anticipation of Smith's conclusions, the Department of Transport withdrew its support in 1954. He was told to cease all activities related to Project Magnet. Smith ended his study and submitted his conclusions. As expected, the engineer wrote that the phenomenon was definitely extraterrestrial in nature. Another study was being carried out at the same time by the Second Story Committee, a joint venture by the Department of Transport and DND. This committee's conclusions were far more conservative. After that, UFOs were relegated to no man's land. The Department of Transport didn't want anything more to do with the matter, and DND didn't see the point in collecting these reports. In 1967, the reports were turned over to the Ottawa Herzberg Institute, part of the National Research Council. But their primary interest in the reports had nothing to do with UFOs.
The Herzberg Institute was the center for geophysical studies, in particular many astronomy studies. A number of individuals there, particularly Dr. Peter Millman, was studying how meteor observations can lead to the discovery of the meteorites themselves on the ground. To do that, he got the cooperation of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to collect reports of unusual lights in the sky, reports of UFOs in some cases, and take the reports from the RCMP to the National Research Council, which was the repository in the Herzberg Institute. These reports were then examined to see if they were in fact possible reports of a fireball or meteor that may have landed on the Earth for possible recovery by the geophysicists themselves, in which case it would be very important scientifically. If they were not considered to be meteors, they were considered non-meteoric. And the Herzberg Institute had a very small file every year of perhaps 20 to 30 cases of reports from people who had seen unusual objects in the sky which were not meteors and were something else, something much more mysterious. You see, the National Research Council itself was not interested in UFOs, but the possibility that UFO reports might lead to the recovery of meteorites. But in order to do so, they had to collect the case reports and the sighting reports themselves. So every year, the file accumulated larger and larger and was transferred at the end of each year to the National Archives of Canada. And these files of UFO reports can be seen today by anyone who wishes to do so at the National Archives.